Sarah, when people hear your story, they always ask the same thing. How does someone go from losing absolutely everything to discovering something that changes not just their life, but their understanding of who they are?
You know, Tony, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. Divorce papers on Monday, pink slip on Wednesday, eviction notice on Friday. I was convinced my life was over. But when I drove up to my grandmother's old house with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, I had no idea I was walking into something far bigger than my own tragedy. That house had been waiting for me, just like it had waited for all the others.
What do you mean by all the others?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Sarah, I want to take our listeners back to that moment when you first stepped out of your car at your grandmother's house. You'd driven, 4 hours from the city?
4.5, actually. I kept taking the wrong turns on those winding country roads. Everything looked so different from when I was a child. The trees had grown taller, thicker. Some of the old landmarks were just gone.
Tell me what you saw when you finally pulled into that driveway.
Pause. The house looked smaller than I remembered, Tony. Isn't that always the way? When you're 7 years old, everything seems enormous. But there it was, this modest 2-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding that had turned more gray than white over the years.
Your grandmother had been gone for how long at that point?
3 years. 3 years of the house sitting empty while the lawyers sorted through the estate complications. My father had been paying someone from town to check on it occasionally, but no one had really lived there since Grandma Rose passed.
And you had a key?
I had to get one from Mrs. Patterson, who lives about a mile down the road. She was the one keeping an eye on things. Sweet woman, probably in her 70s now. She remembered me from those childhood summers.
What did she say when she saw you?
She took one look at me standing on her porch with my 2 suitcases and said, "You look just like your grandmother did when she first came to that house." That struck me as odd because I'd always assumed Grandma Rose had lived there her whole life.
But she hadn't.
Apparently not. Mrs. Patterson said Grandma Rose had come to the house as a young woman, maybe in her 30s, said she looked lost, just like I did. Then Mrs. Patterson handed me this old brass key and said, "That house has a way of calling to women when they need it most."
Those were her exact words.
Pause, yes. I remember them clearly because they gave me chills. At the time, I thought she was just being poetic, you know. Country folk have their ways of speaking.
So you drove back to the house with the key. Walk me through opening that door for the first time.
The porch steps creaked under my feet. The same sound I remembered from childhood. There were leaves scattered across the wooden boards and spider webs in the corners. The key turned easily, though. Too easily for a lock that hadn't been used in 3 years.
The door just opened.
It swung open with barely a push, and I was hit with this smell. Not musty or stale like you'd expect from a closed-up house. It smelled like lavender and something else. Something warm, like bread baking.
That must have been unsettling.
It was comforting, actually. That's what unsettled me. I should have been walking into a cold, empty house that felt foreign and sad. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey.
Describe what you saw inside.
Everything was exactly as I remembered it, but cleaner somehow. The hardwood floors gleamed like they'd been recently polished. Grandma Rose's furniture was still there, covered with white sheets, but even the sheets looked fresh. The late afternoon sunlight was streaming through the lace curtains in the front parlor.
Someone had been maintaining the interior?
That's what I assumed. I made a mental note to thank Mrs. Patterson for going above and beyond. I walked through the downstairs first. The kitchen still had Grandma's old cast-iron stove and the farmhouse sink. Her rocking chair was still by the window where she used to sit and shell peas.
Were there photographs still around? Personal items?
Some. A few family photos on the mantelpiece. I found one of myself as a little girl sitting on Grandma Rose's lap on that very porch. We were both smiling, but looking at it now, there was something in her eyes, a kind of knowing sadness.
What do you mean by knowing sadness?
Like she understood something about life that I was too young to grasp then. In the photo, she's looking at me with such tenderness, but also like she was trying to memorize that moment, like she knew our time together would be limited.
You only visited during summers?
Just a few summers when I was very young. My parents stopped bringing me when I turned 10. They said I was getting too old for country visits, that I needed to focus on school and city activities. But I think there was more to it.
What makes you say that?
The way my father acted whenever Grandma Rose's name came up. He'd get this tense look, change the subject quickly, My mother would just shake her head and say, "Your father's family has always been complicated, Sarah."
Did you ever ask your grandmother directly about the family dynamics?
I was too young to understand there was anything to ask about. When you're a child, you accept the world as it's presented to you. I just knew that summers at Grandma's house were magical, and then suddenly they stopped.
So there you were, 25 years later, carrying your suitcases up those same stairs.
The stairs didn't creak the way I remembered. Each step was solid, silent. I chose my old room, the one at the front of the house that looked out over the meadow. The bed was made up with fresh linens.
Fresh linens in a house that had been empty for 3 years?
I know how it sounds, Tony, but I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. I'd lost my job on a Monday, found my husband cheating on a Wednesday, and been evicted from our apartment on Friday when I couldn't make the rent without my income.
You were in survival mode.
Exactly. So when I found clean sheets and towels, I just felt grateful. I didn't want to question the only good thing that had happened to me in months. I unpacked my few belongings and sat on the bed, looking out at that meadow.
What did you see out there?
Wildflowers everywhere, purple and yellow blooms swaying in the evening breeze. The sun was setting behind the tree line, painting everything golden. There were fireflies starting to blink on and off near the tall grass.
The same view from your childhood?
Similar, but different. The meadow seemed bigger somehow, wilder, like it had reclaimed itself while the house sat empty. There was something peaceful about that, something that made me think maybe I could reclaim myself too.
That first night, did you sleep well?
Pause. I slept better than I had in months, which surprised me. I'd expected to toss and turn, worrying about my future, replaying all my failures. Instead, I fell asleep to the sound of wind chimes on the porch.
Wind chimes?
Grandma Rose always had wind chimes, different sets hanging from the porch ceiling. They played these soft, melodic tones whenever the breeze picked up. Very soothing.
And you woke up feeling?
Rested for the first time in weeks. But also curious. There was this sense that the house was waiting for something, waiting for me to discover something.
Did you explore more that second day?
I spent the morning going through Grandma's things more carefully. Her clothes were still in the bedroom closet, dresses and cardigans that smelled faintly of her perfume. I found her jewelry box with a little ballerina that still turned when you opened it.
Any letters or documents that might explain the family tensions your father had shown?
Not in the obvious places, but I did find something interesting in the kitchen. A recipe box filled with cards written in different handwriting. Not just Grandma Rose's careful script, but other hands. Some of the cards were dated decades apart.
Recipes passed down through generations?
That's what I thought initially. But some of the recipes were strange, not for food exactly. There were cards with instructions for things like tea for new beginnings and soup for letting go, written more like remedies than recipes.
What did you make of that?
Grandma Rose had always been interested in herbs and natural healing. I figured it was just her way of organizing folk remedies she'd collected over the years. But the different handwriting styles bothered me.
Why?
Because some of those cards looked much older than they should have, given when Grandma Rose would have lived in that house. And the paper on some of them was completely different. Older, yellowed, like they'd been written in a different era entirely.
Did you try any of the recipes?
I made the tea for new beginnings that second evening. It called for chamomile, lavender, and something called heart's ease, which I found growing wild in the herb garden behind the house.
There was still an active herb garden.
Overgrown, but thriving, like it had been tending itself. The heart's ease was blooming everywhere, these tiny purple and white flowers that looked like little faces. When I brewed the tea, it tasted like hope, if that makes any sense.
I think our listeners understand that feeling, Sarah. Sometimes comfort comes from unexpected sources.
That night, I sat on the porch with my tea, listening to those wind chimes. And for the first time since my life had fallen apart, I felt like maybe everything would be okay. Maybe this house could be the sanctuary I needed while I figured out my next steps.
But something changed that feeling of peace.
Not changed exactly. Deepened it, but in a way that was almost unsettling. I started noticing little things that didn't quite add up, like how the house stayed cool during the day without air conditioning, even though it was late July, or how I never saw any dust settling on surfaces.
As if the house was maintaining itself?
Pause. I know how that sounds, Tony, but yes. And there were sounds at night. Not frightening sounds, just movement. Like someone walking quietly through the rooms below while I slept.
Did you investigate these sounds?
The first few times, I told myself it was just old house settling noises, wood expanding and contracting. But by the end of my first week there, I was certain someone else was in the house at night.
That must have been terrifying for a woman alone in an isolated location.
You'd think so? But I wasn't afraid, which scared me more than being afraid would have. It felt protective, whatever presence was there, like a guardian watching over me while I healed.
When did you decide to search the house more thoroughly?
About 10 days in, I'd been living day to day, just trying to process everything I'd lost and figure out practical next steps. But the curiosity finally overcame my emotional exhaustion. I needed to understand what was happening in that house.
Where did you start?
The basement. I'd never spent much time down there as a child. It was just storage space as far as I knew. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture, that sort of thing. But when I went down with a flashlight, I noticed something I'd never seen before.
Which was?
The basement seemed bigger than the footprint of the house should have allowed. There was this whole section behind the furnace that extended further back than made architectural sense.
An addition that had been built later?
That's what I thought. But when I examined the walls more closely, looking for seams or evidence of construction, I found something else entirely.
Pause. What did you find, Sarah?
A section of the wall that sounded hollow when I knocked on it. Not like there was empty space behind it, but like it was a different kind of wall altogether. Thinner. False.
And that's when you decided to investigate further?
I almost didn't, Tony. Part of me wanted to just accept the mystery and live peacefully in that house. But something compelled me to understand. Maybe it was the way Grandma Rose had looked in that old photograph, like she had secrets she wished she could have shared.
So you found a way behind that false wall?
It took me 2 more days to work up the courage. But yes, I found a loose panel near the floor, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. And what I discovered on the other side changed everything I thought I knew about that house and about my family.
We'll explore that discovery in our next conversation, Sarah. For now, thank you for sharing this part of your story with us.
Thank you, Tony. It helps to talk about it even though I'm still processing what it all means.
Sarah, when you first pulled up to your grandmother's house that day, what was going through your mind?
Long pause. Honestly, Tony, I felt like I was driving backwards through time. The gravel driveway still made that same crunching sound under my tires, and the old maple tree, the one with the tire swing, it was still there, though the rope had long since rotted away.
How long had it been since you'd visited?
Nearly 15 years. I kept meaning to come back after Grandma Rose passed, but life in the city just swallowed me whole. Career, marriage, the endless cycle of obligations. Now I realize I was avoiding it.
What were you avoiding exactly?
Pause the memories, I suppose. That house held so much of my childhood, but also so much of my grandmother's stories. She used to tell me the most extraordinary tales about the women who had lived there before us.
Tell me about those stories.
Oh, Tony, Grandma Rose had this way of weaving history into bedtime stories. She'd talk about a woman named Eleanor who came to the house during the Depression, completely destitute. Or Margaret, who arrived in the 50s after her husband left her with nothing but debt. There was always this common thread, women who had lost everything, finding their way to that house.
Did you believe these stories as a child?
Children believe everything and nothing at the same time, don't they? Part of me thought they were just fairy tales, but there was something in Grandma's voice when she told them, a certainty. She'd describe these women with such vivid detail, the way Eleanor would hum while kneading bread, or how Margaret planted roses along the eastern wall because they reminded her of her mother's garden.
And when you returned that day, driving up to the house as an adult, did those stories come flooding back?
Like a dam bursting. I sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at the house. It's this beautiful old Victorian, Tony, painted white with green shutters, though the paint was peeling when I arrived. 3 stories, with a wraparound porch and these tall windows that seem to watch you.
That's quite an image, windows that watch you.
Grandma used to say the house had eyes. I thought it was just her poetic way of speaking, but sitting there that afternoon, with the late sun casting shadows across the facade, I understood what she meant. The house felt alive, expectant somehow.
What was your emotional state at that moment? You'd just lost your job, your marriage had ended, and you'd had to leave your apartment.
Devastated doesn't begin to cover it, Tony. 3 days earlier, I was a successful marketing director with a corner office overlooking the city. I had what I thought was a solid marriage, a beautiful apartment in the arts district. Then my company downsized. My husband admitted he'd been having an affair for 2 years, and I discovered he'd been siphoning money from our joint accounts.
That's an enormous amount of loss to process in such a short time.
It felt like my entire identity had been stripped away. I was 53 years old, starting over with nothing but my grandmother's house, a house I'd inherited but never really claimed. Driving up that driveway, I felt like I was admitting defeat.
But you got out of the car eventually.
Soft laugh, I did. The key was still hidden under the loose board on the porch, exactly where Grandma always kept it. My hands were shaking as I turned it in the lock. The door opened with this long, low creak that I remembered from childhood.
Describe what you found inside.
Time had stopped, Tony. Everything was exactly as Grandma had left it. The floral wallpaper in the hallway, though faded. The grandfather clock, silent now. Her reading chair by the window with a book still open on the side table. Something about medicinal herbs, I remember.
How did the house feel to you?
Peaceful, but heavy somehow. Like it was holding its breath. There was this scent in the air, lavender and old wood and something else I couldn't place. Something earthy and deep. The late afternoon light was streaming through those tall windows, casting everything in gold.
You mentioned your grandmother told stories about other women who had lived there. As you walked through the house that first day, did you think about them?
Constantly. I found myself wondering which room had been Eleanor's during the Depression. Whether Margaret had sat in that same reading chair, looking out at the garden. There were layers of history in that house, Tony. I could feel them in the worn spots on the wooden floors, in the way certain doors hung slightly askew.
What about your grandmother herself? What kind of woman was Rose?
Extraordinary. She was one of those women who seemed to contain multitudes. On the surface, she was a typical country grandmother, baking pies, tending her garden, preserving vegetables. But underneath, there was this deep wisdom. She understood people in a way that seemed almost mystical.
How so?
She could look at someone and see not just who they were, but who they were meant to become. When I was young and struggling with self-doubt, she'd tell me stories about strong women who had overcome impossible odds. When I was being too prideful, she'd share tales of humility and grace. It was like she had a story for every human condition.
And she'd inherited the house from someone else?
Yes, from her great-aunt Cordelia. Grandma always said the house chose its caretakers, that it called to women who needed shelter, who needed to remember their own strength. I used to think that was just her romantic way of looking at inheritance. But now...
Now you're not so sure?
Pause. Let's just say that first evening in the house, as I sat in Grandma's chair watching the sun set over the fields, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of belonging, but also a sense of purpose. Like I was exactly where I was meant to be.
That must have been a profound feeling after such devastating losses.
It was unsettling, actually. I'd come to the house feeling defeated, planning to hide away and lick my wounds. But there was something in the air that night, Tony. Something that whispered of possibilities rather than endings.
What did you do that first night?
I made tea using herbs from Grandma's garden. They'd somehow maintained themselves all these years. I sat in her chair and watched darkness fall over the countryside. And for the first time in months, I felt truly quiet inside. Not empty, but quiet. Ready to listen.
Listen to what?
Pause. At the time, I thought I meant listen to my own thoughts, my own heart. But now I wonder if the house was already beginning to speak to me, beginning to share its secrets.
That's quite a mysterious way to put it.
The house has always been full of mysteries, Tony. Grandma used to say every old house keeps secrets, but some houses keep secrets that are meant to be discovered. I was about to learn just how true that was.
Sarah, when you first walked into your grandmother's house that day, what struck you most about the place?
Long pause, the silence, Tony. It was so complete it felt almost alive. I'd grown accustomed to the constant hum of the city, traffic, neighbors, air conditioning units. But standing in that entryway, it was like stepping into a pocket of time that had been sealed away.
You'd been away from the house for how long?
Nearly 15 years. I visited occasionally when grandmother was still with us, but after she passed 5 years ago, I couldn't bring myself to return. Too many memories, I suppose. And frankly, I was too busy building what I thought was my real life in the city.
Tell me about the house itself. Paint me a picture of what you walked into.
Voice softening. It's a Victorian farmhouse, built in 1892. Grandmother always said it had good bones, and she was right. The front door opens into this wide hallway with dark wood paneling that runs halfway up the walls. There's a staircase with this beautiful carved banister that curves up to the second floor. To the left is the sitting room, to the right the dining room, and straight back is the kitchen.
And the condition of everything after all those years?
Remarkably well preserved. The lawyers had arranged for basic maintenance. But it was more than that. It felt like the house had been waiting. Dust covered everything, yes, but underneath, the furniture was exactly as I remembered. Grandmother's reading chair by the window, her collection of blue and white china still displayed in the dining room hutch, even her knitting basket beside the fireplace with yarn still trailing out of it.
That must have stirred up quite a few memories.
Pause. Oh, it did. I could almost hear her humming in the kitchen, smell her lavender soap lingering in the air. She had this way of moving through the house like she was dancing to music only she could hear. Grandmother was always so certain of her place in the world, so rooted. Even as a child, I found that both comforting and somehow mysterious.
Mysterious how?
Well, she'd lived in that house her entire married life, raised 4 children there, buried her husband from the front parlor. But there were always these little inconsistencies in her stories. She'd mention women who'd stayed with her over the years, distant relatives, she'd say, or family friends who needed a place to recover from various hardships. But the details never quite added up.
What kind of details?
Names that changed depending on when she told the story. Dates that didn't align. I remember asking her once about a woman she'd mentioned named Eleanor who supposedly stayed with her in the 1960s. But then later she referred to the same woman as Helen and placed her visit in the 1950s. When I pointed it out, Grandmother just smiled and said memory was a funny thing.
Did you think much about those inconsistencies at the time?
Not really. I was young and then busy with my own life. I assumed it was just Grandmother getting older, perhaps mixing up different visitors. But walking through that house again, Tony, those stories came flooding back. And there was something about the atmosphere that made me wonder if there wasn't more to them.
The atmosphere?
It's hard to explain. The house felt inhabited in a way that went beyond Grandmother's presence. Like layers of lives had been lived within those walls, layers of stories that had somehow seeped into the wood and plaster. I found myself moving more quietly, as if I might disturb something.
Where did you start when you began settling in?
The kitchen, naturally. It's the heart of any home, isn't it? I opened windows to air out the staleness, wiped down counters, checked what was still usable. Grandmother's cast-iron skillet was still hanging on its hook, seasoned and ready. Her recipe box sat on the windowsill, cards yellowed but readable. I made myself tea using her old kettle, and the familiar whistle of it brought me right back to childhood summers.
Those summers must have been quite different from your city life.
Like stepping into another world. Grandmother would wake before dawn, and I'd hear her moving about downstairs, starting bread or tending to her garden. By the time I came down for breakfast, she'd already accomplished more than I managed in most full days. She knew every bird by its song, every plant in her garden by touch. The rhythm of that place was so different. Slower, but somehow more intense.
You mentioned her garden. Was it still there when you returned?
Overgrown, but yes. Grandmother's roses had grown wild along the fence, and her herb garden had spread beyond its original borders. But there were paths worn in the grass that I remembered, places where she'd walked the same route every day for decades. I stood at the kitchen window that first evening, looking out at those paths in the fading light, and I could almost see her figure moving among the plants.
It sounds like the house held on to more than just physical memories.
Pause. That's exactly right. There was a weight to the place, but not an unpleasant one. More like the weight of stories waiting to be told. I remember thinking that if walls could talk, these walls would have volumes to share.
Little did you know how prophetic that thought would prove to be.
Quiet laugh indeed. That first night lying in Grandmother's bed, which felt presumptuous, but the guest room seemed even stranger. I listened to the house settling around me. Old wood creaks and sighs, wind moving through spaces I'd forgotten existed. But there was something else, too, a sense of anticipation, almost. As if the house itself was waiting to see what I would discover.
And you had no idea yet about the basement?
None whatsoever. I was focused on making the main floors livable again, on figuring out how to rebuild my life in this place that felt both utterly familiar and completely foreign. The basement was just the basement, a place for storage and the furnace. I had no reason to think it held anything more significant than Grandmother's canning supplies and Christmas decorations.
But something drew you down there eventually.
Pause. Yes, but that's a story for another conversation, isn't it?
Sarah, you mentioned that after settling into your grandmother's house for a few days, something happened that changed everything. Can you walk me through that moment?
Long pause. It was my 4th night there, Tony. I'd been sleeping poorly. The house creaks in ways I'd forgotten, and every sound felt amplified in that silence. But this particular night was different.
Different how?
I woke up around 2 in the morning to this rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch against the window, but it was too regular, too deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention.
That must have been unsettling, being alone in an isolated house.
Terrifying is more accurate. I lay there for maybe 20 minutes, just listening. The tapping would stop for a few minutes, then start again. Always the same rhythm. 3 short taps, pause, 3 short taps.
Did you investigate the source?
Eventually, yes. I grabbed the old flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The electricity in that house has always been unreliable, and followed the sound. It was coming from below, from the basement.
And you went down there, in the middle of the night?
Laughs nervously. I know how that sounds, Tony, but you have to understand I was already at rock bottom. My marriage was over, my career destroyed, my entire life in shambles. What was the worst that could happen? More loss?
That's a profound way to look at fear when you've already lost everything.
Exactly. So I opened that old basement door, the hinges screaming like they hadn't been used in decades, and made my way down those wooden steps. The tapping got louder as I descended.
What did you find down there?
At first, nothing unusual. Just grandmother's old storage area. Boxes covered in dust, furniture draped in sheets, the smell of must and time. But the tapping was definitely coming from the far corner, behind this old wardrobe that I remembered from childhood.
Behind the wardrobe?
I managed to pull it away from the wall. It was lighter than I expected, like it had been moved before. And there, Tony, was something I'd never seen in all my years visiting that house. A section of the wall that looked different.
Different in...
The wood paneling was newer, cleaner. No dust, no age marks. It was maybe 4 feet wide and went from floor to ceiling. And the tapping, it was coming from directly behind it.
How did you react to that discovery?
I stood there for the longest time, just staring. Part of me wanted to run back upstairs, pack my things, and drive back to the city. But another part of me, a part I didn't recognize, felt drawn to that wall.
What do you think that was about? That feeling of being drawn in?
Pause. Looking back, I think it was the first time in months that I felt curious about something instead of just defeated. Here was a mystery, something that belonged to my family's history that I knew nothing about.
So you investigated further?
I ran my hands along the edges of the different paneling. There was a slight gap on one side, barely noticeable. When I pressed against it, I could feel it give slightly, and the tapping stopped.
Completely?
Dead silence. Like whatever was making the sound knew I'd found what it wanted me to find. That should have scared me more than it did.
But it didn't?
No, Tony. Instead, I felt this strange sense of purpose. For the first time since my world collapsed, I had something to focus on besides my failures. I went back upstairs, found some tools in grandmother's kitchen, and returned to that wall.
You decided to open it? Right then?
I couldn't wait until morning. It sounds irrational, but I felt like if I left it until daylight, I might lose my nerve. Or worse, convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing.
What did you find when you managed to get through?
Long pause. A small room, Tony. Maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. It had been carefully constructed, with proper ventilation and even a small light fixture. But that's not what took my breath away.
What was it?
Books. Dozens and dozens of journals, all arranged on shelves that lined 3 walls. Each one was different. Different covers, different sizes, different levels of wear. Some looked decades old, others appeared almost new.
Journals written by whom?
That's what I had to find out. I picked up the nearest one, opened it to the first page, and read something that made my blood run cold. It was dated 15 years earlier, and the first line was, "I came to this house after losing everything. My husband, my job, my sense of who I was."
That must have felt surreal, given your own circumstances.
I thought I was hallucinating, Tony. I grabbed another journal from a different shelf. This one was dated 30 years ago. The opening line was almost identical. "I have lost everything that mattered to me, and now I find myself in this house, searching for answers."
How many journals were there?
I stopped counting after 20. Each one I opened began the same way. Different handwriting, different decades, but the same story. Women who had lost everything, who had come to this house, and who had found something here.
Found what?
That's what I needed to discover. I gathered as many journals as I could carry and took them upstairs. I made coffee, settled into grandmother's old reading chair, and began to read. I read until the sun came up, Tony, and what I learned changed everything I thought I knew about that house.
We're going to need to hear about those journals, Sarah. But first, how did it feel to realize you weren't the first woman to seek refuge in that house under those circumstances?
Pause. Frightening and comforting at the same time. I wasn't alone in my devastation, but I also wasn't the first to stumble into whatever mystery that house was hiding.
Sarah, you mentioned finding your grandmother's house exactly as she'd left it. But something changed that first week, didn't it?
Long pause, yes. It was the third night, I think. I'd been avoiding the basement entirely up to that point.
What made you finally go down there?
The heating system kept making these awful noises, clanging, like someone was hitting the pipes with a wrench. I'd been ignoring it, but that night it was so loud I couldn't sleep.
So, you went to investigate.
With a flashlight and my phone, yes. The basement steps creaked something terrible. I remember thinking my grandmother never mentioned how unsettling this house could be at night.
What did you find down there?
At first, just what you'd expect. Old furnace, some storage boxes that musty smell basements have. The noise had stopped, of course, the moment I got down there.
Of course it did. But you didn't just check the furnace and leave, did you?
No. Tony, I can't explain it, but I felt drawn to examine the walls more carefully. There was this section that looked different somehow.
Different how?
The mortar was a slightly different color. Newer, maybe. And when I pressed against it, it gave just a little. Like there was space behind it.
What went through your mind in that moment?
Honestly, I thought about leaving it alone. Going back upstairs, pretending I hadn't noticed anything strange. Part of me knew that once I started investigating, there'd be no going back.
But you kept going anyway.
I did. I went back upstairs and found a hammer in my grandmother's toolbox. My hands were shaking the whole time.
What were you thinking as you went back down?
That I was probably making a terrible mistake. That some secrets are meant to stay buried. But Tony, I'd lost everything. My marriage, my career, my sense of who I was. What was one more life-changing discovery?
So, you broke through the wall.
It didn't take much force. Just a few careful taps and chunks of mortar started falling away. Behind it was this small space, maybe 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep.
And that's where you found them.
Pause the journals, yes. Dozens of them, all different ages and conditions. Some were leather-bound, others were simple composition notebooks. They were stacked so carefully, Tony, like someone had been collecting them for decades.
What was your first reaction when you saw them?
I sat on that cold basement floor and just stared. Part of me wanted to seal that wall back up immediately, but another part of me was desperate to understand why someone would hide these books so carefully.
Did you bring them upstairs right away? What made you choose that particular one?
The wear on the cover. It had clearly been handled a lot, loved, and when I opened it, the handwriting was so beautiful, so careful, it felt safe somehow.
Safe in what way?
Like whoever had written in it had taken time with their words. Had something important to say. I needed that kind of intention in my life right then.
Where did you go to read it?
Back to my grandmother's kitchen. I made tea and sat at her old table with that journal, and Tony, reading those first pages changed everything.
How so?
The woman who'd written it, she described losing her husband, her home, her entire support system. And then she wrote about coming to this exact house, my grandmother's house, to start over.
That must have felt eerily familiar.
It was like reading about my own life, but written 40 years earlier. The same feelings of failure, of being completely lost. Even some of the same phrases I'd been using to describe my situation.
What did you do with that realization?
I kept reading. I had to know what happened to her, how her story ended. But also, I was terrified to find out.
Terrified why?
Because if this woman had experienced the same kind of devastation I was going through, and she'd ended up in this house just like I had, then maybe my being here wasn't the random coincidence I'd convinced myself it was.
You were starting to see a pattern.
Exactly. And patterns suggest intention, don't they? Someone or something had orchestrated this convergence of broken women and this particular house. I just didn't know why yet.
But you were determined to find out.
Pause, yes. Even though every instinct told me I should pack my bags and leave immediately, I knew I had to understand what I'd stumbled into.
Sarah, you mentioned finding those journals changed something fundamental in how you saw your situation. But I'm curious about the practical side of things. How were you managing day-to-day in that old house?
Pause. Well, Tony, that's where things get interesting. The house had been sitting empty for 2 years after my grandmother passed, but somehow the utilities were still connected. I never did figure that out completely.
That seems unusual. Did you look into who might have been maintaining it?
I called the electric company, the water department. They had records showing the bills were current, but when I asked who was paying them, I got transferred from person to person until finally someone told me the account was handled by an estate management company that no longer existed.
How did that sit with you? Most people would find that unsettling.
Honestly, I was too exhausted to care much at first. I had about $800 to my name and nowhere else to go. If someone was mysteriously keeping the lights on, I wasn't about to complain. But as days passed and I started reading more of those journals, I began to wonder if this was part of whatever pattern these women had experienced.
You're talking about the other women who had lived in the house. What kinds of patterns were you noticing in their writing?
Each journal started the same way, Tony. A woman in crisis, usually middle-aged, arriving at the house with nothing left. They'd write about feeling grateful for shelter, then confused by small kindnesses they couldn't explain. Food appearing in the pantry, repairs being done while they were out walking, mail being forwarded without them setting it up.
That would make most people want to leave, wouldn't it?
You'd think so. But here's what struck me about these women, and maybe about myself too. When you've lost everything that defined you, when the life you built crumbles completely, you stop questioning good fortune. You start accepting it because you have to believe something in the universe is finally working in your favor.
Tell me more about that feeling, Sarah. What was it like to have your sense of control stripped away?
Long pause. I'd spent 23 years married to David, building what I thought was a solid life. I had routines, expectations, a role to play. When he left, when I lost the job I'd held for 15 years, it wasn't just the practical losses. I didn't know who I was without those external structures.
And being in your grandmother's house, reading about other women who faced similar upheavals, how did that affect your sense of identity?
It was like looking into mirrors from different decades, Tony. One journal from 1987, written by a woman named Margaret, described the exact same feeling of being untethered. Another from 2003 by someone called Elena wrote about the strange relief of having no expectations to meet anymore.
Relief? That's an interesting word choice.
Think about it. When everything falls apart, you're also freed from the exhausting work of holding it all together. These women wrote about sleeping deeply for the first time in years, about not checking their phones, because there was no one left to disappoint them.
But surely there was also fear, uncertainty about the future.
Oh, absolutely. Elena wrote pages about panic attacks, about calling her sister at 3 a.m. Margaret described days when she couldn't get out of bed. But underneath the fear, there was something else emerging in their writing.
What kind of something else?
Curiosity, I suppose, about who they might become without all the roles they'd been playing. Margaret started painting again for the first time since college. Elena began learning Spanish, something she'd always wanted to do but never had time for.
And what about you, Sarah? What were you becoming curious about?
Pause the house itself initially. Why my grandmother had never mentioned owning all those journals. Why she'd kept them hidden behind that false wall. But gradually, I started wondering about deeper things, like whether the person I'd been in my marriage was really me, or just who I thought I needed to be.
That's a profound question to grapple with in your 50s.
The women in the journals wrestled with it too. There's something about losing everything at this stage of life that forces you to examine what's actually yours versus what you've collected to please other people.
Did reading their experiences help you process your own situation?
In ways I didn't expect, Tony. It made me feel less alone, certainly, but it also made me wonder if I'd ended up in that house by accident, or if somehow I was meant to continue something these women had started.
What do you mean by continue something?
Pause. That's where the mystery deepens, and where I started to realize I wasn't just a visitor in that house. I was becoming part of its story.
Sarah, you mentioned finding those journals changed something fundamental about how you saw your own situation. But I'm curious about the practical side of things. How were you actually managing day to day during those first weeks?
Long pause. That's the question I was dreading, Tony. Because the truth is, I wasn't managing very well at all. I'd wake up each morning in my grandmother's old bedroom, and for just a moment I'd forget where I was. Then reality would crash back.
What did those mornings look like for you?
I'd lie there staring at the water stains on the ceiling, making mental lists of everything I needed to do. Fix the plumbing, find work, figure out how to pay for groceries. But then I'd think about those women in the journals, and I'd wonder if they felt this same paralysis.
Paralysis is a strong word.
It was accurate, though. I remember one morning I spent 3 hours just sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, trying to work up the courage to check my bank balance on my phone. 3 hours, Tony.
What finally got you moving?
The pipes burst in the upstairs bathroom. Bitter laugh, nothing like a flood to force you into action. I'm standing there in 2 inches of water, holding towels that were already soaked through, and I realized I had 2 choices. I could call a plumber I couldn't afford, or I could figure it out myself.
And you chose to figure it out yourself.
I chose to try. I drove into town to the hardware store, and the man behind the counter took one look at me and asked if I was Helen's granddaughter. Word travels fast in small places.
How did that feel, being known as Helen's granddaughter rather than just Sarah?
Pause. Complicated. This stranger knew more about my family history than I did. He started telling me stories about my grandmother, how she'd come in during the 70s and buy supplies to fix everything herself. Apparently, she was quite the character.
What kind of stories?
He said she once rewired the entire house during a thunderstorm because she was tired of the lights flickering. Another time, she built a greenhouse from scratch after reading a single library book about construction.
Sounds like resourcefulness ran in the family.
That's what scared me, Tony. What if it didn't? What if I was the weak link who inherited the house but none of the strength that came with it?
But you were there, trying to fix the pipes.
Trying being the operative word. I flooded the basement that first attempt. When I went down to assess the damage, that's when I noticed something odd about the wall where I'd found the journals.
Odd how?
The water damage revealed more loose boards. Behind them, I found something that made my hands shake.
What was it?
Long pause, more journals, Tony. But these were different, older. The handwriting was faded, but I could make out dates from the 1940s and 1950s. And there were photographs tucked between the pages.
Photographs of what?
Women. Standing in front of the house, but the house looked different in each photo. Garden layouts changed, rooms renovated, additions built. It was like watching the house evolve through decades.
And these women, did they look familiar?
That's the unsettling part. In some ways, yes. Not their faces, but something about their expressions. They all had this same look of determination mixed with exhaustion, like they'd been tested and were still standing.
How did discovering these older journals affect your perspective on your own situation?
Pause. It made me realize I wasn't the first person to feel completely lost in that house. But it also raised new questions. Why did these women all end up there? What was it about losing everything that led them to the same place?
Did you find any answers in those older journals?
And what I found made me understand that my grandmother's house wasn't just a refuge, Tony. It was a place where women went to discover who they really were when everything else was stripped away.
That's a profound realization.
It was also terrifying. Because if these journals were telling the truth, then the transformation I was beginning to feel wasn't just about learning to fix pipes or manage money. It was about becoming someone I'd never been before.
Someone you'd never been, or someone you'd always been but never had the chance to discover?
Long pause? That's exactly the question that kept me awake at night, Tony.
Sarah, when we left off last time, you'd found those journals and were beginning to read through them. I can only imagine how unsettling that must have been, discovering all those women's stories in your grandmother's house.
Unsettling doesn't begin to cover it, Tony. I spent the entire night reading through journal after journal. Each one written by a different woman, but the stories were so eerily similar. Women who'd lost everything just like I had and somehow found their way to that house.
What was it about their stories that struck you the most, beyond the obvious parallels to your own situation?
The transformation they all described. Every single woman wrote about arriving broken, desperate, at the end of their rope. But then something would shift. They'd write about feeling connected to something larger than themselves, about discovering strength they didn't know they possessed.
Did they mention your grandmother specifically, or give any indication of how they knew about the house?
That's what was so strange, Tony. Some of the journals dated back to the 1940s, long before my grandmother even lived there. But yes, in the more recent ones from the 70s and 80s, they mentioned her by name. They called her Eleanor, though she'd always insisted I call her Grandma Ellie.
Eleanor. Pause. How did these women describe her?
Like she was some kind of guardian angel. One woman, Margaret, wrote about arriving in 1978 after her husband's gambling had cost them their farm. She described my grandmother as someone who understood loss in a way that went beyond words. Said Eleanor had this ability to see right through to your soul.
That must have been difficult to read, learning about this side of your grandmother you'd never known.
It broke my heart, Tony. All those years I thought I knew her, thought I understood our relationship. She'd raised me after my parents died, but she never once mentioned these other women, never hinted at this pattern of helping people rebuild their lives.
Children often see only one facet of the adults in their lives. What else did you discover in those journals?
The house itself seemed to play a role in their healing. They all wrote about the garden, about working the soil with their hands, about the silence that felt alive rather than empty. One woman, Catherine, wrote that the house held memories like a library holds books.
Memories of what?
Of resilience, Tony. Of every woman who'd walked those floors and chosen to keep going instead of giving up. Catherine wrote that you could feel it in the walls, this accumulated strength from decades of women who'd refused to let their losses define them.
Did reading these accounts change how you felt about being there yourself?
Initially, it terrified me. I felt like I was part of some cosmic joke, like my life had been orchestrated to lead me to that exact place. But as I kept reading, the fear transformed into something else.
What kind of transformation?
A sense of belonging I'd never experienced before. These women weren't victims, Tony. They were warriors who'd learned to fight battles I was just beginning to understand. Reading their words felt like receiving letters from older sisters I'd never known I had.
You mentioned that some of the journals were quite old. What did you learn about the house's history?
The earliest journal was from 1943, written by a woman named Ruth, whose husband had been killed in the war. She described finding the house abandoned and making it her refuge, but even she wrote about feeling like the house had been waiting for her.
As if there was some intentional purpose to it.
Exactly. Ruth wrote about discovering herbs growing wild in what became the garden, about finding old letters hidden in the walls that suggested other women had sought shelter there before her. It was like the house had always been a sanctuary, even before any of us understood why.
Did these women stay in touch with each other? Was there any sense of community among them?
That was one of the most beautiful discoveries, Tony. In the later journals, I found references to letters, to visits. My grandmother had apparently maintained connections with many of them long after they'd moved on from the house. She'd created this invisible network of women supporting each other.
A sisterhood of survivors.
Yes, and reading about it made me realize how isolated I'd become in my city life. I'd thought independence meant not needing anyone. But these women understood that true strength comes from connection, from knowing you're not alone in your struggles.
How long did you spend reading that first night?
Until dawn, Tony. I was completely absorbed. When the sun started coming up, I was reading the most recent journal, dated just 2 years before my grandmother's death. It was written by a woman named Diana who'd lost her daughter in an accident.
That must have been particularly difficult to read.
Diana's pain was so raw, so immediate on those pages, but she also wrote about conversations with my grandmother that revealed so much about Grandma Ellie's wisdom, how she'd learned that grief isn't something you get over, but something you learn to carry with grace.
Did Diana's story have a resolution?
She wrote about leaving the house after 8 months, but not because she was running away this time. She was ready to face her life again, to honor her daughter's memory by living fully instead of just surviving.
What was your emotional state after reading all of these accounts?
Overwhelmed, but also strangely comforted, Tony. For months I'd been carrying this crushing sense of failure, like my life falling apart was evidence of some fundamental flaw in my character. But these journals showed me that sometimes we have to lose everything to discover what we're actually made of.
Did you feel pressure to follow the same pattern as these other women?
At first, yes, like I had to live up to their example of transformation. But as the days passed, I realized that wasn't the point. The house wasn't about following someone else's path. It was about creating the space to discover your own.
When you finally closed that last journal, what was your first impulse?
I wanted to call my grandmother, Tony. Long pause. I wanted to tell her I finally understood what she'd been trying to teach me all those years about the difference between being alone and being lonely, about finding strength in stillness.
But of course, you couldn't make that call.
No, but I could feel her presence in that house more strongly than I ever had when she was alive. It was as if reading those journals had opened a door between us that grief had previously kept locked.
What happened next, Sarah? After that revelation?
I knew I had to make a choice, Tony. I could run again, or I could trust the process these women had described. Trust that sometimes the only way forward is to stop moving long enough to remember who you are underneath all the roles you've lost.
Sarah, you mentioned finding more journals after that first discovery. How did that change your understanding of what you'd stumbled into?
Long pause. It became clear this wasn't just some family secret, Tony. The handwriting was different in each journal. Different decades, different women. I found one from 1967, another from 1982, one as recent as 2003, all describing the same pattern.
The same pattern of loss and arrival at your grandmother's house?
Exactly. Women who'd lost marriages, jobs, children to estrangement. They'd all somehow ended up at that house when they had nowhere else to go. And they all wrote about the same thing happening to them.
Which was what exactly?
A kind of awakening. They'd arrive broken, desperate. Then slowly something would shift. They'd start seeing their lives differently. Old regrets would surface, but also this strange clarity about who they really were underneath all the roles they'd been playing.
That sounds almost mystical. What did you make of it?
Pause. I'm a practical person, Tony. I teach high school literature. I don't believe in haunted houses or magic, but I couldn't ignore what I was reading. These women were describing experiences I was having myself.
Such as?
Dreams that felt more real than my waking hours. Memories surfacing from childhood that I'd completely forgotten. And this overwhelming sense that everything that had happened to me, all the loss, was somehow necessary.
Necessary for what?
For me to finally stop running from myself. I'd spent 25 years in a marriage where I played the perfect suburban wife. I taught literature but never wrote a word of my own. I had opinions I never voiced, dreams I never pursued.
The journals were showing you that other women had faced similar reckonings?
More than that. They were showing me that this house somehow strips away everything false, forces you to confront who you really are when nobody's watching, when you have nothing left to lose.
Did any of the journals mention your grandmother specifically?
That's what haunted me most, Tony. Several mentioned a woman who'd lived there before them, someone who understood their pain. The descriptions matched my grandmother perfectly, but she would have been different ages at different times.
As if she'd been there far longer than should have been possible?
I started questioning everything I thought I knew about her. She'd lived in that house my entire life, but I realized I never knew how long she'd been there before I was born. My mother rarely talked about her own childhood.
What did you decide to do with this information?
I almost left, Tony. Packed my car twice, but something kept pulling me back to those basement journals. There were empty ones, too. Blank books placed there as if waiting.
Waiting for what?
For the next woman who'd need to write her way through the darkness. I found myself picking up a pen, starting to write my own story. Not just what had brought me there, but things I'd never admitted to anyone.
About your marriage? Your old life?
About how I'd been sleepwalking for decades. How I'd chosen safety over authenticity so many times I'd forgotten what my own voice sounded like. How my grandmother had tried to tell me things when I was younger that I wasn't ready to hear.
What kinds of things?
That losing everything isn't the end of your story. It's often the beginning. That women in our family had a particular gift for reinvention, but only after we'd been stripped down to our essential selves.
Did you begin to see your losses differently?
Pause. The divorce stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like freedom. Losing my job stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like redirection. Even losing the apartment felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit.
How long did this process take?
Months. Winter turned to spring while I read those journals and wrote in my own. I started gardening like my grandmother had, cooking her recipes. I felt her presence more strongly than when she was alive.
Were you becoming someone new, or remembering who you'd always been?
Both, I think. The woman I was meant to be before I learned to make myself small, before I learned to apologize for taking up space. The journals showed me that transformation isn't about changing yourself. It's about finally having the courage to be yourself.
And the other women who'd been there before you?
I began to understand that I was part of something larger, a chain of women helping each other across time, leaving breadcrumbs for whoever would need the house next.
Sarah, you mentioned finding more journals after that first night. What did you discover as you kept reading?
Well, Tony, that's where things became truly extraordinary. Each journal told essentially the same story, but from different women across different decades. There was Margaret from 1987, who'd lost her husband and home. Elena from 2003, who'd gone through a bitter divorce and bankruptcy.
The same pattern repeating itself.
Exactly. But here's what shook me to my core. In the very last journal I found, buried at the bottom of that wooden box, I recognized the handwriting immediately.
Your grandmother's.
Yes. But Tony, the entry was dated just 3 months before she died, and in it, she wrote something that changed everything I thought I knew about that house, about her, about my entire family history.
What did she write?
She wrote, "The next woman will be Sarah, my granddaughter. I've seen the signs in her life, the same patterns that brought me here 40 years ago, that brought all of us here. The house doesn't choose randomly."
She knew you would come there.
She knew, Tony. But that wasn't the most startling part. She wrote that she had been placing those journals there deliberately, one by one, over the years. She'd been in contact with some of these women long after they'd left the house.
So your grandmother was orchestrating this somehow?
Not orchestrating, more like stewarding. She wrote that the house had a way of calling to women who needed what it could offer, but that someone had to help them understand what was happening to them.
Help them understand what exactly?
That's when I found the final piece, Tony, hidden in a different part of her journal. She wrote about a conversation she'd had with her own grandmother in 1952, right after she'd arrived at the house herself, heartbroken and desperate.
This pattern goes back even further.
Generations, Tony. Her grandmother told her that the house had been in our family for over a century, and that it had always served this purpose, a place where women could shed their old selves completely and discover who they really were underneath all the roles and expectations.
And your grandmother continued this tradition.
She did. She wrote that after her transformation, she couldn't bear to leave the house empty. So she stayed, and whenever she encountered a woman in crisis, someone whose spirit was broken in just the right way, she would guide them there.
How would she know who needed it?
She worked as a counselor for 30 years, Tony. She had a practice in the nearest town, an hour's drive away. She would identify women who were experiencing what she called the necessary devastation and somehow arrange for them to learn about the house.
The necessary devastation.
That's what she called it, the complete unraveling that has to happen before you can rebuild from your authentic center. She believed some people needed to lose everything external before they could find what was eternal inside them.
And she was preparing this experience for you specifically.
Tony, I sat in that basement reading her words, and I realized that my entire crisis, everything that had fallen apart in my life, it all happened right after she died, as if she had been holding something at bay, and once she was gone.
The house called to you.
She wrote that she'd been worried about me for years, watching me build a life that looked successful but wasn't truly mine. She said she could see I was becoming smaller and smaller, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me.
How did that make you feel, reading those words?
Terrified at first. The idea that my grandmother had somehow foreseen my breakdown, maybe even allowed it to happen. But then I kept reading, and she wrote something that made me understand.
What did she write?
I cannot save Sarah from her necessary devastation, but I can offer her a place to transform it into wisdom. The women who find this house are not victims, Tony. They are phoenixes who simply forgot they could rise from ashes.
And that changed how you saw your situation.
Everything shifted in that moment. I realized I wasn't some random person who'd stumbled into a strange house. I was part of something much larger, something that had been waiting for me my entire life.
What did you do with this knowledge?
I went upstairs and called my sister for the first time in months. I told her I was staying in grandmother's house, and that I was exactly where I needed to be.
How did she respond to that?
She cried, Tony. She said she'd been hoping I would find my way there eventually.
Sarah, when you found those journals in the basement, you mentioned they all described the same transformation. What exactly did you discover about that pattern?
Long pause. The transformation wasn't what I initially thought, Tony. At first, I believed these women had all experienced some supernatural change in the house. But reading deeper into the entries, I realized something far more profound.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Each woman wrote about losing everything. Their marriages, their careers, their sense of self. They came to the house broken, just like I did. But the transformation they described wasn't mystical. It was psychological, emotional.
How so?
The house didn't change them, Tony. The isolation did. Being forced to sit with their pain, with no distractions, no escape routes. They had to face who they really were underneath all the roles they'd been playing.
That sounds terrifying.
It was. But also liberating. I found entries where women wrote about discovering talents they'd buried, dreams they'd abandoned. The transformation was them becoming their authentic selves for the first time in decades.
And this happened to you as well?
Pause, yes. But there's more, Tony. Something I hadn't understood until I read the final journal I found.
Which was?
My grandmother's. Hidden behind all the others. She'd been collecting these stories for 40 years, leaving the house to women who needed it most.
She was orchestrating this?
Not orchestrating. Offering sanctuary. She'd been through her own transformation there in the 1960s after my grandfather left. She understood that sometimes we need to lose everything to find ourselves.
So your inheritance wasn't random?
She'd been watching my life from a distance, Sarah. Saw my marriage failing, my career stagnating, the timing of her death, leaving me the house right when everything collapsed. It wasn't coincidence.
She planned it.
She gave me what she'd given dozens of other women, a place to break down completely so I could rebuild authentically. The journals weren't just records, Tony. They were proof that this kind of transformation was possible, that I wasn't alone in feeling lost.
And now?
Now I understand why she made me promise to maintain the house. I'm not just the latest woman to transform here, I'm the next guardian, the next person responsible for offering this sanctuary to someone who needs it.
Sarah, you mentioned finding something else in that basement, something that changed everything about how you understood the house.
Long pause. Behind the journals, there was a loose stone in the wall. When I pressed it, a section swung open like a door.
A hidden room?
More like a chamber. Small, maybe 6 feet square. The walls were covered in names, Tony. Hundreds of them carved into the stone. Some looked ancient, others recent.
The same women from the journals?
Yes, but so many more. Going back decades, maybe centuries. And at the center of the room was a chair, simple wood, worn smooth by countless hands.
What did you do?
I ran. Straight back upstairs, grabbed my keys, and drove to the nearest town. Spent the night in a motel, trying to convince myself I was losing my mind.
But you went back.
The next morning, yes. Because running away is what got me into this mess in the first place, isn't it? Running from my marriage problems, from facing my career failures, from dealing with my grandmother's death properly.
So, you returned to the house with a different mindset.
I realized those women weren't victims, Tony. They were survivors. Each one had faced their darkest moment and found something in that house, in that room, that helped them rebuild.
What do you think was really happening there?
I think some places hold memory, hold strength. My grandmother knew when she left me the house. She knew I'd need it eventually, just like she had, just like her grandmother before her.
And the chair in the hidden room?
I sat in it, just for a moment, and I felt them, Tony. All those women who'd sat there before me, who'd faced their fears in that space and come out stronger.
That must have been overwhelming.
Overwhelming, yes, but also clarifying. I understood that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was blessed by courage. Each woman who'd been there had left something behind, some piece of their strength for the next person who'd need it.
So you made your decision.
I made my decision. I was going to stay. Not hide away like I'd been doing, but truly stay. Plant roots. Become part of that legacy of women who rebuilt their lives from nothing.
Even knowing what you knew about the house.
Especially knowing what I knew.
Sarah, you mentioned earlier that you felt the house was preparing you for something. As you read through more journals, did that feeling intensify?
Long pause it did, Tony. Each woman's story followed the same pattern. They'd arrive broken just like I had. Then they'd find strength they never knew they possessed. But there was always this final moment, this test where they had to choose between staying safe in the house or stepping back into the world.
What kind of test? Was it something supernatural or more psychological?
That's what I was trying to understand. The journals became more cryptic near the end of each woman's stay. Margaret from 1978 wrote about the choice that comes with the storm. Elena from 1995 mentioned facing the mirror when it calls.
The mirror. You've referenced that several times. What was significant about it?
There was this antique mirror in the master bedroom. I'd catch glimpses of movement in it sometimes, but when I'd look directly, nothing was there. The women all wrote about it, showing them something important about themselves.
Were you afraid to look?
Nervous laugh, terrified, honestly. But I knew I couldn't hide forever. The house had given me so much clarity about my failed marriage, my career mistakes, even my relationship with my grandmother. I was becoming someone I actually respected again.
So you felt ready for whatever this test might be?
Not ready, exactly. but prepared. I'd found my grandmother's journal hidden behind the others. She'd been the first woman to stay in the house, back in 1943. Her husband had died in the war and she'd lost everything.
What did she write about her experience?
She wrote that the house didn't change people, Tony. It revealed who they truly were beneath all the pain and fear. The test wasn't something the house imposed. It was about choosing to trust yourself enough to face the world again.
And you realized you'd reached that point?
The morning I woke up and didn't immediately feel that crushing weight on my chest. For the first time in months, I felt curious about what the day might bring instead of dreading it.
So you decided to look in the mirror?
Deep breath. I decided to stop running from myself. Whatever I saw, whatever happened next, I knew I could handle it. The house had taught me that much.
Sarah, you mentioned finding something else in that basement. Something that changed everything for you.
Long pause, the final journal. It was different from the others, Tony, written in my grandmother's handwriting.
Your grandmother? But you said she never mentioned any of this to you.
She couldn't. The journal explained everything. How she'd discovered the house's secret in 1952 when she was young and desperate. How she'd experienced the same transformation I was going through.
What did she write about this transformation exactly?
That the house doesn't change you, Tony. It reveals you. All those women, including my grandmother, they came here broken and left whole because they finally had space to hear their own voices.
And you believed this? After everything you'd been through?
I wanted to dismiss it as grief or desperation, but then I found her letter addressed to me specifically. She knew I'd end up here someday.
How could she know that?
She wrote that women in our family carry a particular strength, but we often lose ourselves trying to fit into lives that weren't meant for us. The house was her gift to future generations who would need that same refuge.
That must have been overwhelming to read.
Terrifying, actually. Because she was right about everything. My marriage, my career, the way I'd been living for everyone except myself.
What did you do with that realization?
I sat in that basement for hours, reading her words. She wrote about watching me as a child, seeing how I dimmed my light to make others comfortable. She knew I'd eventually need a place to remember who I really was.
Did that change how you saw your time in the house?
Completely. I stopped seeing it as running away and started seeing it as coming home, not to a place, but to myself.
And the other journals? Did they make more sense after reading your grandmother's?
Each woman's story became a roadmap. They'd all found their way back to their authentic selves in that house. Some stayed, some left, but they all left transformed.
Sarah, what was the most important thing your grandmother's journal taught you?
Voice softening that losing everything isn't the end of your story, Tony. Sometimes it's the beginning of the story you were always meant to write.
Sarah, you're standing in that basement, holding Margaret's journal from 1987, and you realize what?
That I had a choice, Tony. Every woman who came before me faced the same moment. They could stay trapped in their grief, or they could choose to rebuild.
And what did you choose?
I chose to honor them. Margaret, Ruth, Eleanor, all of them. I gathered every journal and brought them upstairs. Pause, I built a shrine in the living room.
A shrine?
Not a morbid one, a celebration. Their photographs, their stories, their dreams. I realized this house wasn't cursed or magical. It was a sanctuary where broken women found the space to heal.
So the transformation wasn't supernatural.
The transformation was hope, Tony. Pure human resilience. These women didn't need magic. They needed time, solitude, and the courage to rebuild from nothing.
And you found that courage?
I found it in their words, in their refusal to surrender. That night, I wrote my own first entry in a new journal.
So Sarah, as we wrap up your remarkable story, what would you say to someone who's lost everything and feels like there's nowhere to turn?
I'd tell them that sometimes the places we think we're running away from are exactly where we need to be. That old house taught me something I never expected.
Which was?
That I'm not the first woman to feel completely broken, and I won't be the last. Those journals showed me a lineage of resilience I never knew existed.
Do you still live in your grandmother's house?
I do. But it's different now. I've added my own journal to the collection behind that wall. Pause, for whoever comes next.
And you believe someone will?
Oh, I know they will. The house has a way of calling to women who need it most. I've learned to trust in that kind of quiet magic.
Any regrets about leaving your old life behind?
None. Sometimes losing everything is just another way of saying you're finally free to find what was always meant to be yours.
So here we are, Sarah, at the end of your remarkable journey. When you first arrived at that house, broken and lost, could you have imagined where it would lead?
Soft laugh. Not in a million years, Tony. I thought I was running away from everything. Turns out I was running towards something I didn't even know I needed.
The journals, the women who came before you, what do you think they were really teaching you?
That losing everything isn't the end. It's just clearing space for who you're meant to become. Each woman found her own version of that truth.
And the house itself? What role did it play?
It was like a cocoon, I suppose. A safe place to fall apart completely before putting myself back together. The walls held so many stories of transformation.
You've decided to stay there permanently now.
Yes, and I've started my own journal. For the next woman who'll need to find her way back to herself. The house will be waiting, just as it waited for me.